12 elite interpreters sweating through their tailored suits. A billion-dollar merger evaporating over a single mistranslated proverb. The CEO, cold and furious, watching her legacy crumble in real time. And then, a voice from the corner of this boardroom. Not a corporate shark, but the guy holding the mop. He didn't just speak their language. He knew their slang, their culture, their pride. He was a ghost with a minimum wage badge and a sick kid to feed. Here's how a janitor hijacked the boardroom and brought a billionaire to her knees. The water in the yellow plastic bucket always turned gray by 2 a.m. Augustus Davies stared down at it, watching the dirty suds pop and vanish. It smelled of industrial bleach and cheap pine, a scent that had permanently settled into the creases of his hands. He wrung out the mop. His shoulders ached with a dull, persistent throb. He was 34, but his spine felt 50. He pushed the mop across the Italian marble lobby of Montgomery Global. Left to right, right to left. The rhythmic shh was the only sound in the cavernous, glass-walled atrium. To the executives who strode past him during the day, Augustus wasn't a man. He was infrastructure. He was the human equivalent of a Roomba in faded blue overalls. They didn't see the heavy bags under his eyes, or the way he subtly dragged his left leg when the damp weather flared up old shrapnel pain. They certainly didn't see the panicked math running constantly behind his eyes. Rent, $400. Inhalers for Leo, $120. Groceries, $300 if we skip meat. Electric bill, past due. Augustus finished the lobby and dragged his cart toward the service elevator. He pulled a cracked smartphone from his pocket, the screen webbed with fractures. A text from Mrs. Higgins, his elderly neighbor who watched his 6-year-old son at night. He's asleep. Coughing stopped around midnight. Left some soup on the stove for you. Augustus exhaled. The tension in his chest loosened just a fraction. Leo, a kid with lungs too small for the polluted city air, and a smile that could break a man in half. After Augustus's wife died, a sudden aneurysm that wiped out their savings, their future, and Augustus's anchor, he had stopped living. He merely survived. The high-stress, high-travel life he used to lead was impossible now. He needed a job where he could clock out, turn off his brain, and rush home to be a father. So he traded a passport stamped with 50 countries for a blue janitorial badge. He rode the elevator up to the 40th floor, executive territory. This was the domain of Claire Montgomery. Augustus had only seen her in passing. She was a blur of charcoal wool, sharp cheekbones, and an aura of absolute, terrifying competence. People didn't just walk out of her way, they evaporated. She was 32, inheriting a sprawling logistics and mining empire from a ruthless father, and spending every waking second proving she was twice as vicious as he had been. Tonight, the 40th floor was alive. It was 3:15 a.m., and the lights in the main boardroom were blazing. Augustus parked his cart in the shadow of a pillar. Through the soundproof glass walls, he watched a pantomime of high-end panic. Claire Montgomery stood at the head of a massive mahogany table. Her usually immaculate hair was pushed back, a slight fraying at the edges of her composure. She was surrounded by men in suits, all staring intently at screens, phones, and stacks of dossiers. They were prepping. Augustus knew the signs, the manic energy of an impending siege. He pulled a small, battered earbud from his pocket and popped it into his right ear, hiding it beneath the collar of his shirt. He tapped his phone. A rapid-fire stream of news audio flooded his ear. Not English, it was a local broadcast from Kinshasa, spoken in rapid-fire Lingala. Augustus listened, his brain effortlessly categorizing the inflections, the political undertones, the subtle slang. He moved his mop, left to right. Before his life collapsed into hospital bills and yellow buckets, Augustus hadn't been a nobody. He was the son of two nomadic anthropologists who dragged him through the poorest, most isolated, and most volatile regions on Earth. He didn't just learn languages in a classroom, he learned them in the dirt. He learned Arabic bargaining for bread in Amman. He learned Mandarin translating for mechanics in Shenzhen. He learned French, Swahili, Flemish, and Lingala, surviving a brutal 3-year stint running logistics for an NGO in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Languages weren't academic to Augustus. They were survival tools. He spoke 8 of them fluently, not just with grammatical perfection, but with the grit and grease of a local. He watched Claire Montgomery drag a hand down her face. She looked exhausted. For a brief second, the icy billionaire veneer cracked, and Augustus saw something he recognized all too well. The desperate, suffocating weight of being the only one holding the roof up. A man in a sharp suit stormed out of the boardroom doors. He didn't look at Augustus. He bumped right into the mop bucket, splashing dirty water onto the toe of his $600 Oxford shoe. "Jesus Christ," the man hissed, glaring at the puddle. He finally looked up at Augustus. "Watch what you're doing, you idiot." Augustus didn't blink. He didn't apologize. He just looked at the man's shoes, then up to his flushed, panicked face. "Floor's wet," Augustus said, his voice flat, gravelly. The man scoffed, turning back towards the boardroom. "Just clean it up. The Boca delegation arrives at 8:00 a.m. If this floor isn't spotless, you're fired." Augustus watched him walk away. The Boca delegation. Augustus switched the audio on his phone to a French financial broadcast. The Boca Group was a notoriously insular consortium of Belgian and Congolese mining magnates. They held the rights to the largest untapped cobalt veins in the Katanga region, and they hated Americans. They hated the arrogance, the assumption that English was the center of the universe. Augustus looked back through the glass at Claire Montgomery. She was betting the farm on this deal. If she lost it, the stock would tank, the board would oust her, and hundreds of people, including the invisible man with the mop, would be out of a job. Augustus gripped the mop handle. He had his own problems. Rent, inhalers. He lowered his head and started wiping up the spill. By 9 a.m., the temperature in the Montgomery Global boardroom had dropped to absolute zero. Augustus was meant to be off the clock, but his supervisor had forced him to stay for the morning shift. "VIPs in the building. We need bodies on standby for spills, trash, whatever they want. Don't look at them. Don't speak to them." Augustus stood in the narrow kitchenette attached to the boardroom, out of sight, organizing rows of sparkling water bottles. The kitchenette had a slatted vent that opened directly into the main room. Augustus could hear everything. The atmosphere was toxic. Claire Montgomery sat rigidly at the head of the table. Opposite her sat Jean-Luc Boca and his 3 lieutenants. Boca was a massive man in his 60s, exuding the kind of terrifying calm that only came from possessing immense unchecked wealth. He didn't smile. He barely moved. Sitting between the two factions was a rotating cast of high-end interpreters. Montgomery Global had hired an elite translation firm. 12 specialists. They were currently rotating through the hot seat, and they were failing spectacularly. Augustus listened as the third interpreter, a nervous woman with a flawless Parisian accent, attempted to translate Claire's proposal for a staggered equity buyout. "Monsieur Boca, Madame Montgomery propose une structure d'achat échelonnée," the interpreter began. Augustus winced silently in the kitchenette. Parisian French. Boca was from a specific district in Brussels, but spent 10 months of the year deep in the Katanga province. He viewed Parisian French as weak, overly academic, and deeply insulting. Boca let the woman finish. He stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then he spoke in a low, rumbling rumble. It wasn't French. It was Lingala. "Bazomeka koko sabisoneti banamaik." They are trying to trick us like little children. The Parisian interpreter froze. She adjusted her earpiece. Excuse me, Monsieur Boca. Could you repeat that in French? Boca's eyes narrowed. He looked at Claire. Your translator does not understand the language of my business, Miss Montgomery. How do you expect to manage our minds if you cannot understand the people pulling the ore from the dirt? Claire's jaw tightened. She shot a lethal look at the lead translation manager, who was sweating profusely in the corner. Swap, Claire ordered quietly. A new interpreter scrambled into the chair. A man this time. The negotiations resumed. It was a bloodbath. Augustus leaned against the steel counter of the kitchenette, closing his eyes. He could map the disaster like a car crash in slow motion. The interpreters were technically proficient, but they lacked context. When Claire used aggressive corporate idioms like killing the competition or driving a wedge, the translators converted them literally. To Boca, a man who had survived actual brutal civil conflicts over mining territory, these phrases didn't sound like business jargon. They sounded like threats. The tension escalated over the next hour. 6 interpreters cycled through. The translation manager was frantically texting, trying to get backup. Claire's voice, usually a smooth, commanding weapon, began to show hairline fractures of stress. Please explain to Mr. Boca that our logistics network will increase his export efficiency by 30%. The 7th interpreter, an older man trying to straddle the line between French and Flemish, leaned forward. He translated the sentence. But he used a Flemish colloquialism for taking control that was heavily associated with the old colonial overseers. Augustus's eyes snapped open in the kitchenette. Oh no, Boca didn't just frown. He stopped breathing. The 3 lieutenants beside him stiffened, their hands dropping below the table. The silence in the room wasn't just awkward, it was dangerous. I beg your pardon, Boca said in heavily accented, chilling English. The interpreter stammered, realizing his mistake but not knowing how to fix it. I meant that Montgomery Global will oversee the transport. You use the words of a master to a dog, Boca snarled, rising from his chair. The wood groaned in protest. We came here for a partnership, Miss Montgomery, not to be managed, not to be colonized. We are done. Panic erupted. Claire shot up from her chair, her hands flat on the mahogany. Mr. Boca, please. There is a misunderstanding. The translation tells me exactly how you view us, Boca yelled, his composure shattering. He barked an order to his men in Swahili. Kusanya karatasi, tunaondoka. Gather the papers. We are leaving. The interpreters sat paralyzed. Claire looked around the room, her eyes wide, realizing that a $3 billion deal, her father's legacy, and her entire career were bleeding out on the expensive carpet. She had no way to stop it. She couldn't speak their language. She couldn't bridge the gap. In the kitchenette, Augustus looked at his phone. A picture of Leo was the lock screen. The kid was smiling, missing a front tooth. Don't do it, Augustus told himself. Keep your head down. Keep the paycheck. This isn't your world anymore. But Augustus knew what it felt like to drown while a room full of people watched. He knew what it felt like to be misunderstood, to be judged by the lowest common denominator. And, looking through the vent at Claire Montgomery's pale, desperate face, he realized she wasn't just a billionaire right now. She was a single human being watching her world end. Besides, Augustus hated bad translations. He grabbed a white linen towel, draped it over his arm, and pushed open the door to the boardroom. The heavy oak door of the kitchenette clicked shut behind Augustus. In a room crackling with shouting and the frantic rustling of papers, the quiet click somehow cut through the noise. Everyone froze. 12 highly paid interpreters, 4 furious mining executives, and 1 billionaire CEO turned to stare at the man in the faded blue overalls. Augustus stood near the wall, a towel over his arm, a spray bottle of glass cleaner hooked onto his belt loop. What are you doing? hissed the executive who had bumped into Augustus earlier that morning. "Security, get this guy out of here!" Boca's lieutenants scowled, insulted by the interruption. Boca himself was turning towards the main doors, his coat already in hand. Augustus didn't look at the executive. He didn't look at Claire. He looked directly into the dark, furious eyes of Jean-Luc Boca. Augustus took a step forward. He cleared his throat. When he spoke, the words didn't come from his throat. They came from his chest, resonant, deep, and carrying the precise, rolling cadence of the southern Katanga province. "Mokonzi, kokende te pona maloba ya pamba. Bazo kanisa malamu, kasi bazali ba boma matoi." Boss, do not leave over empty words. They mean well, but they are deaf to the music. The boardroom went dead silent. The silence was so absolute that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. Boca stopped dead in his tracks. He turned slowly, his eyes wide with shock. He looked at taking in the cheap boots, the faded uniform, the posture of a man who scrubbed toilets for a living. "You," Boca breathed in Lingala. "You speak my tongue?" Augustus bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deep, specific respect in Boca's culture. Not a servant's bow, but the nod of an equal acknowledging a village elder. He switched seamlessly from Lingala to flawless, guttural Flemish, adopting the exact regional dialect of Boca's hometown in Belgium. "He didn't mean to insult your autonomy, Mr. Boca," Augustus said in Flemish, gesturing toward the terrified interpreter. The word he was looking for was collaborate, but he learned his Dutch in a classroom in Amsterdam. He lacks the dirt on his boots to know the difference. One of Boca's lieutenants let out a sudden, bark-like laugh. Claire Montgomery stood frozen at the head of the table. Her eyes darted from Augustus to Boca. She had no idea what was being said, but she could read the room. The lethal tension had shattered. Boca wasn't glaring anymore. He was captivated. "Who are you?" Claire demanded, her voice sharp, though it lacked its usual bite. "How did you get in here?" Augustus finally looked at her. Up close, her eyes were a startling, piercing gray. "I'm Augustus, Miss Montgomery. I mop the 40th floor, and right now I'm saving your company." Before Claire could reprimand his insolence, Boca stepped toward Augustus. The massive man sized the janitor up. "Where did you learn to speak like a son of the Copperbelt?" Boca asked in Swahili, testing him. Augustus met his gaze perfectly, replying in the same rapid Swahili. "I spent 3 years driving supply trucks between Lubumbashi and Kolwezi. I know the roads, I know the mud, and I know that when a man from Katanga gives his word, it is stronger than steel. This company wants to give you the steel. They just don't know how to ask." Boca stared at him for a long beat. Then, the impossible happened. The terrifying billionaire smiled. It was a massive, beaming grin that showed a gold-capped molar. He turned to Claire. "Miss Montgomery, you are a very cunning woman." Claire blinked, trying to catch up. "I am?" "You pretend to be foolish," Boca laughed, pointing a massive finger at Augustus. "You let these expensive idiots insult me just to reveal your true negotiator at the final moment, a man disguised as a peasant, but who speaks with the soul of my people. A test of my patience." Claire was a shark. She didn't know what the hell was happening, but she saw the blood in the water. She smoothed her skirt and sat back down, exuding absolute, terrifying calm. "I apologize for the theatrics, Mr. Boca," Claire lied smoothly, never taking her eyes off Augustus. "We find it's the best way to see who we are truly dealing with. Augustus, please, take a seat." The translation manager sputtered. "Mr. Montgomery, this man is a janitor. He has no clearance, no credentials." "Shut up, Greg," Claire snapped, her voice like a whip. "Get out, all of you. Take your 12 degrees and get out of my boardroom." The interpreters scrambled out of the room like beaten dogs. Augustus stood by the wall, the damp towel still hanging over his arm. He looked at the plush, leather executive chair opposite Boca. He thought about his bucket waiting in the hall. He thought about Leo. He unclipped the spray bottle of glass cleaner from his belt and set it on the mahogany table with a heavy thunk. Augustus pulled out the chair and sat down. "All right," Augustus said, looking between Claire and Boca. He leaned forward, resting his calloused hands on the polished wood. "Let's talk about cobalt." The glass cleaner sat in the center of the mahogany table, like a grenade. Augustus didn't touch it. He just kept his eyes on Boca. The Congolese magnate was leaning forward, his massive elbows resting on the table, evaluating Augustus with the predatory stillness of a lion, deciding if a gazelle was worth the sprint. Claire Montgomery sat frozen. For the first time in her life, she had surrendered control of her own boardroom. She didn't have a choice. The man in the blue overalls had the reins. "Tell the woman," Boca rumbled in Lingala, his voice thick with gravel, "that I will not sign over 51%. This is my soil. My ancestors bled into it. I do not rent it out to Americans in high towers." Augustus didn't immediately translate. He let the words hang in the air, understanding the weight behind them. He turned to Claire. "He says the equity split is a non-starter," Augustus said in English, his voice calm, conversational. "Your proposal asks for a 51% controlling stake. To him, you aren't asking for a business partnership. You're asking for the deed to his house while he's still living in it. He views it as a surrender of sovereignty, not a financial transaction." Claire's corporate instincts flared. "That's standard for foreign infrastructure investments. We take the majority risk, we take the operational control. Explain to him that without our supply chain, his raw cobalt rots in the sun." Augustus looked at her. Her tone was sharp, algorithmic. She was playing chess, but Boca was playing poker with live ammunition. "I can tell him that," Augustus said quietly. "But if I translate that directly, he will walk out that door, and he will sell the rights to the Chinese consortium currently waiting at the Waldorf Astoria." Claire's eyes widened. She hadn't told anyone about the Chinese bid. It was a deeply buried intelligence report. "How do you know about that?" she whispered. "Because the guy sitting to Boca's left," Augustus nodded subtly toward a thin man with a scar on his jaw, "was complaining in Swahili about the terrible tea they were served at the Waldorf yesterday afternoon. Montgomery Global only serves coffee. You aren't his only meeting." Claire's throat swallowed dryly. She looked at the janitor, really looked at him. The heavy bags under his eyes, the permanent crease of exhaustion between his brows, the absolute, terrifying lack of intimidation in his posture. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't afraid of Boca. He was just a man doing a job. "What do I offer him, Augustus?" she asked. It was the first time she had used his name. It tasted strange in her mouth. Augustus turned back to Boca. He didn't use French. He didn't use Lingala. He switched to a highly specific, older dialect of Kikongo, a language spoken deeply in the rural mining communities. It was a language of labor, of the earth. "The woman understands your pride, Mokonzi," Augustus spoke softly, leaning in. "But she is a builder, not a conqueror. She does not want to rule your land. She wants to pave the road so your trucks don't sink in the mud during the wet season. Give her 49%. Let her build the roads. You keep the soil." Boca's eyes widened slightly. Hearing Kikongo in a New York boardroom was like finding a diamond in a trash can. It bypassed his defensive armor completely. 49, Boca murmured in the same dialect. "But she pays for the extraction machinery up front. No loans? Cash." Augustus pivoted to Claire. "Offer him 49%. He retains majority ownership, which saves his face in Katanga. In exchange, you front the capital for the extraction machinery out of pocket. No interest loans. You buy the shovels, he owns the dirt." Claire did the math in her head. It was a massive upfront expenditure, but the long-term yield with a 49% stake was astronomical, and more importantly, it kept the Chinese out. Done, Claire said firmly. Augustus turned back to Boca. He smiled, a genuine, tired smile that reached his eyes. He extended his right hand, gripping his own right forearm with his left hand, the traditional, deeply respectful handshake of the Katanga region. Twapangana, Augustus said. We have a deal. Boca let out a booming laugh that rattled the glass walls of the boardroom. He reached across the table and clasped Augustus's hand, his massive grip swallowing the janitor's calloused fingers. You are a wolf in sheep's clothing, my friend. Boca laughed in French. He looked at Claire, giving her a slow, appreciative nod. You have my signature, Miss Montgomery. Have your lawyers send the amended papers to my hotel, but only if this man delivers them. He will, Claire said, her heart hammering against her ribs. The next 10 minutes were a blur of handshakes and departing pleasantries. The Boca delegation swept out of the boardroom, leaving behind a sudden, ringing silence. Claire stood alone at the head of the table. Augustus was already standing by the wall. He picked up his spray bottle and hooked it back onto his belt. He draped the dirty towel over his arm. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man who was 10 minutes late for his next shift. Augustus, Claire said, her voice echoing in the empty room. He stopped, his hand on the handle of his mop bucket. Yeah. How did you do that? She asked, walking slowly toward him. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her feeling brittle and exposed. Who are you? I'm the guy who cleans the 40th floor, Augustus said. His voice was flat. The charismatic, commanding negotiator was gone. The exhausted father was back. And my shift ended an hour ago. If I miss the 10:15 bus, I don't get home until noon. Claire frowned, genuinely bewildered. People didn't speak to her like this. They groveled. They postured. I just closed a $3 billion acquisition because of you. You're not leaving. Sit down. I want to know your background. I want to know why a man with your linguistic profile is pushing a mop. Augustus turned to face her. The look in his eyes was so devoid of corporate reverence that it physically stopped her in her tracks. Ms. Montgomery, Augustus said quietly, you have $3 billion. I have $12 in my checking account, and a son with asthma who has been coughing since midnight. You measure time in fiscal quarters. I measure it in inhaler puffs. I don't care about your deal. I don't care about your boardroom. I just want to go home to my kid. He pushed the yellow bucket toward the door. The wheels squeaked loudly. I'll clean the lobby tomorrow, he said over his shoulder. The heavy door clicked shut. Claire was left standing alone in the multi-million-dollar room, staring at the wet streak on the carpet where the bucket had been, feeling poorer than she ever had in her life. The N train smelled of stale urine and wet copper. Augustus sat slumped in the hard plastic seat, his chin resting on his chest. The adrenaline of the boardroom had evaporated, leaving behind a toxic sludge of fatigue in his muscles. He watched the dark tunnel walls streak past, his mind already miles ahead of the train. He keyed the lock to his apartment in Queens at 11:30 a.m. It was a cramped fourth-floor walk-up. The air inside was thick and warm, smelling faintly of chicken broth and Vicks Vapo Rub. Mrs. Higgins, a stout woman in her 70s with a heart of gold and a bad hip, was sitting in the worn armchair by the window, knitting. He's still asleep, Artie, she whispered, looking up. Fever broke around dawn. His breathing is steady. Augustus dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. The sound was too loud in the quiet room. Thank you, Martha. I'm sorry I'm late. The shift went long. He pulled 2 crumpled $20 bills from his wallet and handed them to her. It was exactly half of the cash he had left to his name. She tried to refuse, as she always did, but he pressed it into her wrinkled hand. When she left, Augustus walked into the tiny bedroom. Leo was a small lump under a faded Spider-Man blanket. His pale face was peaceful, his chest rising and falling with a slight, papery wheeze. Augustus knelt by the bed. He pressed the back of his rough hand against Leo's forehead. Cool. No fever. He closed his eyes, leaning his head against the mattress. The crushing weight of his reality settled back onto his shoulders. The boardroom felt like a fever dream, speaking Kikongo to a billionaire, sparring with a corporate titan. It was a different universe, one he had abandoned when Sarah died. Sarah. Augustus looked at the framed photo on the nightstand. Sarah smiling in a dusty Jeep in Kigali, her hair tied back in a bandana. She had been the fierce one. She was the one who dragged him across continents, setting up supply lines for cholera clinics, laughing through the chaos. When the aneurysm took her, sitting at the kitchen table on a random Tuesday, it didn't just stop her heart. It stopped Augustus's world. He couldn't be the man jumping out of helicopters anymore. He had to be a ghost. A ghost could provide stability. A ghost could keep Leo safe. Across the river, in a glass tower piercing the Manhattan skyline, Claire Montgomery was doing something she hadn't done in 5 years. She was doing her own research. She sat at her massive desk, a single desk lamp illuminating the dark wood. The rest of the 40th floor was empty. In front of her was a thin manila folder, the HR file of Augustus Davies. It had taken her threatening the head of human resources with termination to get the file pulled immediately. She opened it. Augustus Davies. Age 34. Position: custodial staff, Tier 2. She flipped past the basic tax forms and background checks. She found his resume. It was aggressively blank. High school diploma. 5 years working for a local landscaping company. 3 years pushing a mop for Montgomery Global. Bullshit, Claire muttered to the empty room. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she rarely used. A private investigator she kept on retainer for corporate espionage. It's Montgomery. I need a deep dive. A man named Augustus Davies. Pull his passport records, tax history, everything before 2021. He's scrubbing his own history, and I want to know why. An hour later, her encrypted email pinged. Claire opened the file. Her breath caught in her throat. The blank spaces in Augustus's life filled in with blinding, vibrant color. Degrees from Georgetown and the London School of Economics. 7 years as the chief logistics officer for Médecins Sans Frontières in sub-Saharan Africa. Clearances with the UN. Letters of commendation from the Belgian embassy for negotiating the safe release of captured medical staff during a rebel uprising in Goma. Then she saw the medical records. Sarah Davies. Deceased. Cause: ruptured cerebral aneurysm. Leo Davies. Age 6. Chronic severe asthma. Monthly medical expenses, $1,200. Claire leaned back in her leather chair. The silence of her office felt oppressive. She looked around at the expensive art on her walls, the imported rug, the skylines of a city she practically owned. She thought about Augustus standing in her boardroom, smelling of bleach, staring down a billionaire warlord, and then walking away because he had to catch a bus to see his sick child. She had spent her entire life evaluating people by their leverage. What did they want? What were they afraid of? How could she use it? Augustus Davies didn't want her money. He wasn't afraid of her power. He was a man utterly stripped of ego, operating on the pure, terrifying fuel of a father's survival instinct. Claire closed the laptop. She didn't feel like a CEO. She felt like a child playing with plastic toys while a war raged outside her window. The next morning, at exactly 8 a.m., Augustus pushed his cart out of the service elevator on the 40th floor. He was exhausted. Leo had woken up twice crying, the remnants of the fever giving him nightmares. Augustus parked the cart and reached for his spray bottle. "Leave it." Augustus turned. Claire Montgomery was standing in the hallway. She wasn't wearing her usual armored power suit. She wore a simple charcoal slacks and a white silk blouse. Her arms were crossed. "I need you to clean the east wing windows today," Augustus said, his voice flat. "The sunlight makes the smudges visible." "You're not cleaning windows today, Augustus," Claire said. She walked toward him. "I want you in my office." Augustus sighed, a deep, rattling sound. "Ms. Montgomery, I don't have time for a disciplinary hearing. If I broke a protocol yesterday, just dock my pay, but I need this job." "You don't have this job anymore," Claire said. Augustus's stomach plummeted. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. Rent, inhalers, food. "Look, I know I overstepped." "I'm firing you as a janitor," Claire interrupted, her voice softening just a fraction. "And I am hiring you as the Vice President of African Operations and Chief Linguistic Liaison." Augustus stared at her. The words didn't compute. "I don't have a suit." "I will buy you a suit." "I don't want a suit," Augustus said, his voice hardening. He gripped the handle of the mop cart. "I don't want your corporate games. I don't want to sit in boardrooms and lie to people for a living. I did my time in the trenches. I'm done." Claire didn't flinch. She stepped closer, invading his personal space. She looked up into his eyes. "I read your file, Augustus," she said quietly. Augustus's jaw locked, the muscles in his neck strained. A flash of pure, unadulterated rage crossed his face. "You had no right to do that. I'm a CEO. I don't care about rights, I care about assets," Claire said, falling back into her ruthless cadence to mask her own discomfort. "You are an asset. You spent 7 years keeping clinics alive in active war zones. You speak 8 languages. You negotiated a $3 billion deal in 5 minutes. Pushing a mop is an insult to your intellect and a waste of my oxygen." "My life is none of your business," Augustus hissed, stepping toward her. For a second, he wasn't the janitor. He was the man who had stared down warlords. Claire held her ground. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of heavy, cream-colored cardstock. She held it out to him. Augustus didn't take it. He looked down at it. "It's a contract," Claire said. "Base salary of $400,000 a year. But that's not the part you care about." She pointed a manicured finger at the second paragraph. Section 4. Platinum Tier Corporate Medical Coverage. Fully vested on day 1. It covers specialists. It covers pediatric pulmonologists. It covers everything. Augustus's eyes dropped to the paper. His vision blurred slightly. The words pediatric pulmonologist hit him like a physical blow. He thought about the agonizing math he did every time he went to the pharmacy. The terrifying sound of Leo wheezing in the dark. "Why?" Augustus asked, his voice cracking just a fraction. "Because I need you," Claire said, dropping the corporate facade entirely. Her gray eyes were completely sincere. "I am surrounded by yes-men, sycophants, and cowards. 12 interpreters failed yesterday because they were terrified of making a mistake. You succeeded because you didn't care about my money. You only cared about the truth." Augustus stared at the contract. It was a lifeline. It was a golden ticket out of the suffocating, terrifying poverty that had trapped him for 3 years. "I have terms," Augustus said, his voice thick. "Name them." "I don't clock in at 6 a.m. I drop my son at school at 8, and I walk in at 8:30, Augustus said, looking up at her. "And I leave at 5 Wasser p.m. Not 5:30. Not 6 to. 5 Ofum. I pick him up. My kid doesn't schedule his asthma attacks around your quarterly earnings." "Done," Claire said instantly. "And I don't play politics," Augustus continued, his eyes narrowing. "If your executives are being idiots, I'm going to tell them they're being idiots. If a deal is bad for the locals on the ground, I will kill it. I will not be your corporate hitman." Claire smiled. It was a terrifying, genuine smile. "Augustus, that is exactly what I am paying you for." 2 days later, Augustus walked onto the 40th floor. He wasn't wearing blue overalls. He was wearing a suit. It wasn't a bespoke Italian masterpiece. It was a dark navy off-the-rack suit from a mid-tier department store. The sleeves were a fraction too long, and the shoulders didn't quite sit flush. But as he walked past the glass walls of the executive suites, the air shifted. The executives who had ignored him for 3 years stared. The man who had bumped into his bucket spilled coffee on his own tie when he saw Augustus walking toward Claire's office. Augustus walked in without knocking. Claire was sitting at her desk, reviewing a stack of contracts. She looked up. She took in the cheap suit, the slight scuff on his brown shoes, and the absolute lack of apology in his posture. "You look like a detective in a bad 90s movie," Claire said smoothly. "I bought it at Macy's," Augustus said, sitting down in the leather chair opposite her. He didn't wait to be invited. "It was on sale. Where are we starting?" Claire pushed a thick dossier across the desk. "The Boca delegation is hosting a formal dinner tonight at the Pierre Hotel. Black tie. We are finalizing the machinery transport logistics. You are my +1. Augustus frowned. "I don't have a tuxedo, and I told you I leave at 5 on pork." "I hired Mrs. Higgins a private nursing service for the evening, fully paid," Claire said without missing a beat. "And a tailor will be at your apartment at 3 p.m. Do not argue with me, Augustus. You are the only reason Boca is speaking to us. You need to be there." Augustus sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Fine, but I'm not eating caviar. It tastes like ocean dirt." The dinner at the Pierre Hotel was a masterclass in opulent anxiety. The ballroom dripped with crystal chandeliers and the hushed, nervous chatter of New York's elite. Waiters in white gloves floated through the room carrying silver trays of champagne. Augustus stood near the bar, looking incredibly uncomfortable. The tuxedo fit him perfectly, highlighting the broad, lean musculature built from years of manual labor, but he wore it like a cage. He held a glass of club soda, watching the room with the analytical eyes of a soldier in hostile territory. Claire walked over to him. She was wearing a stunning, floor-length emerald gown. She looked like royalty. "You're brooding," Claire said, taking a sip of her champagne. "Stop it. You're scaring the hedge fund managers." "They should be scared," Augustus muttered, taking a sip of his soda. "Half of the men in this room are currently trying to figure out how to exploit the labor laws in Katanga. The other half are trying to figure out who I am." "And what have you deduced about me?" Claire asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Augustus looked at her. He didn't look at the dress, or the diamonds at her throat. He looked at the tight, imperceptible tension around her mouth, the way she held her glass like a weapon. "You're lonely," Augustus said simply. The word hit Claire like a physical blow. The easy, corporate smile vanished from her face. She stiffened, her armor slamming shut. "Excuse me? You're surrounded by 300 people, and you haven't had a real conversation with a single one of them," Augustus said, his voice quiet, devoid of judgment. "You inherited a kingdom built on blood and spreadsheets. You spend every day terrified that if you show a single crack of weakness, they'll tear you apart. You're just as trapped in your tower as I was in my basement." Claire stared at him. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. No one spoke to her like this. No one dared. They flattered her. They feared her. But no one saw her. For a terrifying second, she wanted to fire him. She wanted to banish him back to the yellow buckets so she could go back to being perfectly, numbly in control. But then, she looked at the scars on his knuckles. The permanent grief etched around his eyes. He had lost everything, and yet he was the only person in the room who wasn't afraid. "You're an arrogant man, Augustus Davies," Claire whispered, her voice unsteady. "I'm a janitor," Augustus replied softly. "I just know how to read the dirt." Before Claire could respond, A booming voice echoed across the ballroom. "Ah, the wolf!" Jean-Luc Boca was striding across the room, ignoring the panicked executives trying to hand him business cards. He walked straight up to Augustus, his massive arms wide open. Boca ignored Claire entirely. He grabbed Augustus by the shoulders and pulled him into a bone-crushing hug. "Ndeko nangai," Boca boomed in Lingala. "My brother." Augustus smiled, clapping the massive man on the back. "Mokanzi, you look ridiculous in a bow tie." Boca threw his head back and roared with laughter. The entire ballroom went dead silent, staring at the terrifying billionaire laughing with a man nobody recognized. Boca finally turned to Claire. "Miss Montgomery, your wolf has insulted my clothing. I demand a higher percentage of the transport revenue." Claire smiled. The tension in her chest evaporated, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar warmth. She looked at Augustus. "You'll have to take that up with my vice president, Mr. Boca," Claire said smoothly. "He handles all the negotiations, and he doesn't come cheap." A week later, the honeymoon phase of the Boca acquisition officially died in Conference Room B. Montgomery Global's executive committee did not like Augustus Davies. They didn't care that he had salvaged the biggest deal of the decade. To them, the corporate hierarchy was a religion. You put in the hours. You went to the right Ivy League schools. You played golf in the Hamptons. You did not teleport from the janitorial closet to a VP leather chair. Richard Hayes, the chief financial officer, made it his personal mission to expose Augustus as a fluke. Hayes was a man who looked like he had been born wearing a starch-collared shirt. He operated strictly on algorithms, profit margins, and a deep-seated belief that anyone below a six-figure salary was statistically insignificant. It was 10 a.m. The boardroom was packed. Claire sat at the head of the table, her face an unreadable mask. Augustus sat to her right. He was wearing his Macy's suit, an open collar, and a Casio watch that cost $14. Hayes stood at the front of the room, tapping a laser pointer against a massive screen displaying a complex supply chain map of the Democratic Republic of Congo. "The extraction machinery ships out of Antwerp next Tuesday," Hayes announced smoothly, clicking to a new slide filled with bar graphs. "It lands in the port of Matadi by the 14th. From there, we contract local freight carriers to truck the drilling rigs directly across National Route 1 to Kolwezi. We estimate a transit time of 8 days. Operations commence by the 25th. It's an aggressive timeline, but it maximizes Q3 returns." Hayes smiled a thin, predatory smile and looked directly at Augustus. "Unless our new VP of African Operations sees a flaw in the basic arithmetic?" The room went quiet. 10 pairs of expensive eyes shifted to Augustus. They were waiting for the imposter to stumble. Augustus looked at the map on the screen. He didn't look at the graphs. He didn't look at the projected profit margins. He looked at the thin red line tracing from the western coast of Africa straight into the deep interior. Augustus leaned forward. He rested his forearms on the table. "You're sending 70-ton drilling rigs down National Route 1 in late October." "That is the designated highway, yes," Hayes said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Is there a translation issue, Mr. Davies?" "No," Augustus said flatly. "There's a reality issue. You're looking at a line on a map. I've driven that line." Augustus stood up. He didn't ask for permission. He walked to the front of the room, taking the laser pointer right out of Hayes's hand. Hayes blinked, offended by the breach of protocol. Augustus pointed the red dot at a stretch of the map between Kinshasa and Kikwit. "In July, this is a highway," Augustus said, his voice carrying the rough, authoritative timbre of a man who gave orders to stay alive. "In late October, the wet season hits the Kasai region. National Route 1 doesn't just get wet. It turns into 3 feet of liquid, red laterite clay. It's a soup. It swallows sedans whole." Hayes scoffed. "We are using heavy-duty flatbeds, Davies, not sedans." Augustus turned to face him. The sheer intensity in Augustus's eyes made Hayes take a half step back. A 70-ton load on a flatbed hitting Kasai mud in October will sink to the axles in 20 minutes, Augustus stated, stepping closer. Then, the truck behind it tries to pass, and it gets stuck. By day 3, you have a 70-mile traffic jam of stranded freight. The drivers run out of water. The locals start charging $50 for a single bottle. Then the diesel gets siphoned out of your tanks in the middle of the night. Your timeline isn't aggressive, Richard. It's a suicide mission. Your machinery will rust in the jungle until February. The boardroom was dead silent. The executives stared at Augustus. That's anecdotal, Hayes stammered, looking toward Claire for support. The satellite data shows the road is clear. Satellites don't pull trucks out of the mud, Augustus snapped. I did, for 3 years. Augustus clicked the projector off. The room plunged into dim, tense lighting. He tossed the laser pointer onto the table. It clattered loudly against the wood. We reroute, Augustus said, looking directly at Claire. We ship down to Durban, South Africa. We put the rigs on a rail line straight up through Zambia. It costs an extra $400,000 in transit fees, and it adds 12 days to the schedule. But it arrives dry, it arrives safe, and we don't start our partnership with Jean-Luc Boca by losing his drills in a swamp. Claire stared at Augustus. She looked at Hayes, who was red-faced and sweating. She looked back at the man in the cheap suit who had just dismantled her CFO with nothing but dirt-level truth. Do it, Claire said. Her voice cut through the room like a blade. Claire, the quarterly projections, Hayes started. Are fiction, Richard, Claire interrupted coldly. Augustus is dealing, in fact. Make the call to Durban. Reroute the shipment. She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. The executives scrambled to pack their briefcases, eager to escape the suffocating tension. As the room emptied, Augustus stayed by the screen. He ran a hand over his face. He looked exhausted. The adrenaline was fading, leaving the familiar, dull ache in his bones. Claire walked up beside him. She looked at the blank screen. You didn't have to humiliate him, she said quietly. If I didn't humiliate him, he wouldn't have listened, Augustus replied, not looking at her. Men like Hayes only respect a bloody nose. They think the world is built on spreadsheets. They forget that someone has to dig the hole. Claire looked at Augustus's profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the permanent shadow of fatigue under his eyes. You protected my company today. Augustus finally turned his head. I protected the drivers who would have been stranded in the mud. Your company just happened to benefit. He grabbed his notebook and walked out of the room. Claire watched him go. For the first time in her life, she had found an employee she couldn't control, couldn't buy, and couldn't predict, and she had never felt safer. The call came at 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. Augustus was sitting in his new glass-walled office. The view was staggering, a sweeping panorama of the Manhattan skyline. But Augustus rarely looked out the window. He was currently on a secure line with a logistics supervisor in Lubumbashi, rapid-firing Swahili to negotiate a tariff dispute. His cell phone vibrated on the desk. Augustus glanced at the screen. Mrs. Higgins. He held up a finger, signaling the supervisor to wait, and tapped the speaker button on his cell. Martha, I'm in a meeting. Is everything okay? Artie. Martha's voice was reedy, trembling with a panic that froze the blood in Augustus's veins. It's Leo. The nebulizer isn't working. He's turning blue, Artie. I called 911. The ambulance is here. Augustus dropped the desk phone. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. The supervisor in Lubumbashi was still talking. Augustus didn't hear a word. The world narrowed down to a single terrifying pinpoint. The glass walls, the corner office, the multi-million-dollar deal, it all evaporated into meaningless ash. "Which hospital?" Augustus demanded, already sprinting toward the door. "Mount Sinai, Queens!" Martha cried. "I'm on my way!" Augustus burst out of his office. He didn't grab his coat. He didn't tell his assistant. He ran down the executive hallway, his heavy boots pounding against the plush carpet. He bolted past Claire's office just as she was stepping out with a stack of files. He nearly collided with her. "Augustus, wait. I need you to review the—" "I have to go," Augustus gasped, not stopping. He slammed his hand against the elevator button. "Hospital. My son." Claire stopped. She dropped the files on her assistant's desk and walked swiftly toward the elevator bank. She didn't ask questions. She saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in the eyes of a man who was usually made of stone. "My car is downstairs," Claire said, stepping into the elevator with him. "My driver can get through the midtown traffic faster than a cab." Augustus looked at her, his chest heaving. He wanted to argue, to maintain the professional boundary, but he was drowning. He just nodded. The ride to Queens was a blur of blaring horns and screeching tires. Augustus sat in the back of the Maybach, his hands gripped so tightly on his knees that his knuckles were bone white. He stared out the tinted window, seeing nothing. His breathing was shallow. Claire sat opposite him. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him everything would be okay. She knew that in moments of pure crisis, words were just noise. She sat in silence, giving him the one thing he needed: speed. They reached the emergency room entrance. Augustus was out of the car before it fully stopped. The pediatric intensive care unit smelled of rubbing alcohol and bleached linen. It was a chaotic symphony of beeping monitors, hushed voices, and the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. Augustus found Martha Higgins sitting in a plastic chair in the waiting area, clutching her purse to her chest. "Martha," Augustus breathed, dropping to his knees in front of her. "They took him back, Artie," she sobbed, reaching out to touch his face. "His airways clamped shut. The paramedics had to use the oxygen bag in the ambulance." Augustus closed his eyes. The crushing weight of his old life. The life where he couldn't afford the preventative steroid inhalers, the life where he lived in terror of the damp air, slammed into him. "Mr. Davies?" Augustus snapped his eyes open. A doctor in blue scrubs was standing near a set of double doors. Augustus stood up. "I'm Augustus Davies. Where is my son?" "He's stable," the doctor said immediately, recognizing the frantic energy of a terrified parent. The words hit Augustus like a physical blow, knocking the air out of his lungs. He leaned heavily against the wall. "We administered a shot of epinephrine and put him on a continuous albuterol feed," the doctor continued. "His oxygen levels are climbing back to normal. He's exhausted, but he's out of the woods. You got him here just in time." Augustus let out a shuddering breath. He buried his face in his hands. The adrenaline crash was violent, leaving his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Can I see him?" Augustus asked, his voice thick. "Room 4, he's sleeping." Augustus pushed through the double doors. Claire Montgomery stood in the waiting room. She had watched the entire exchange from the periphery. She looked around at the flickering fluorescent lights, the scuffed linoleum floor, the exhausted families huddled in uncomfortable chairs. This was the real world. This was where Augustus lived. 10 minutes later, Claire walked quietly down the hall and peeked into room 4. The room was dim. Leo, a tiny boy with messy brown hair and pale skin, was asleep on the hospital bed. A clear plastic mask covered his nose and mouth, a steady stream of white vapor flowing into it. Augustus was sitting in a chair pulled flush against the bed. He was holding Leo's small hand in his large, calloused one. His head was bowed, resting on the mattress. He wasn't crying, but his shoulders heaved with a silent, heavy relief. Claire stepped back into the hallway. She leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. She thought about Richard Hayes and his quarterly projections. She thought about her $3 billion. She realized that she could buy a continent, but she couldn't buy a single breath of air for a sick child. The sheer fragility of human life, something Augustus understood intimately, terrified her. Half an hour later, Augustus walked out of the room. He closed the door softly. He looked completely drained. He saw Claire leaning against the wall. He stopped. "He's asleep," Augustus said quietly. "I heard the doctor," Claire replied. "I'm glad." Augustus leaned against the wall next to her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The steady beep of a heart monitor echoed from a nearby room. "When Sarah died," Augustus said, his voice barely a whisper, staring straight ahead. "It happened in seconds. 1 minute she was laughing, the next she was gone. I couldn't save her. I was pulling men out of burning jeeps in Goma, but I couldn't save my own wife in our kitchen." Claire turned her head to look at him. She didn't interrupt. "Leo is all I have left of her," Augustus continued, his voice trembling slightly. "He's the only anchor I have to the earth. When I was pushing that mop, I felt like a failure every single day. But I knew exactly where I was. I knew the parameters of my failure. Now, standing in that boardroom, it feels like I'm tempting fate, like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not." Claire reached out. It was a hesitant movement, unnatural to her, but she placed her hand on Augustus's arm. Her grip was firm. "You aren't pretending, Augustus," Claire said fiercely. "You are exactly who you are, a man who fights for the people he loves. You fought for those drivers today. You fought for Leo. You don't belong behind a mop. You belong exactly where you are, because you're the only person in my building who remembers what it costs to be human." Augustus looked down at her hand on his arm. He looked up into her gray eyes. The icy, untouchable billionaire was gone. She was just a woman, standing in a sterile hospital hallway, offering him the one thing he hadn't had in 3 years, an equal. "Thank you, Claire," he whispered. It was the first time he had used her first name. It shifted the air between them, locking a new foundation into place. "Go back in there," Claire said softly, dropping her hand. "Take the rest of the week. HR will handle the paperwork. I'll have Hayes run the reroute through Zambia." Augustus smiled, a faint, genuine movement. "Make sure he pays the Southern rail tariffs up front. The Zambian border guards hate IOUs." "I'll tell him," Claire smiled back. "And Augustus? The company's new medical policy covers this. Everything. You don't owe this hospital a dime." Augustus closed his eyes, the final crushing weight lifting from his chest. He nodded once, turned, and walked back into his son's room. 6 months later. The wet season in the Katanga province was brutal. The heavy rains turned the earth into a vast red ocean of mud. National Route 1 was impassable, choked with stranded vehicles and desperate drivers. But Montgomery Global's extraction machinery wasn't in the mud. It was sitting dry and functional on the high-elevation rails winding through Zambia, arriving at the Boca mining camps exactly on schedule. Jean-Luc Boca called Claire personally on a satellite phone to confirm the delivery. He was ecstatic. He told her that the Chinese consortium had tried to truck their supplies through Route 1 and had lost millions in ruined equipment. "You build good roads, Miss Montgomery," Boca had laughed over the static. "But you hire better men." Montgomery Global's stock soared. The board of directors, previously skeptical of the janitor-turned-VP, suddenly viewed Augustus Davies as a proprietary asset. Richard Hayes was quietly reassigned to domestic logistics, far away from anything involving African operations. But the biggest change wasn't on the balance sheets. It was in the culture of the 40th floor. It was a Friday afternoon. The executive suite was quiet. The glass doors to the main boardroom slid open. Augustus walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore dark jeans, boots, and a simple gray sweater. He still refused to wear ties on Fridays. Walking beside him, holding his hand, was Leo. The boy looked entirely different from the fragile, pale child who had been rushed to the hospital 6 months ago. His cheeks had color. The new daily steroid inhalers, covered entirely by the corporate insurance plan, had rebuilt his lung capacity. He was energetic, wide-eyed, and carrying a bright blue backpack. "Dad, is this where you do the talking?" Leo asked, looking up at the massive mahogany table and the sweeping view of the city. "This is it, buddy," Augustus smiled, lifting Leo up and sitting him directly in the center of the $3 million table. "This is where we figure out how to move big trucks across the dirt." The door to the adjoining office opened. Claire walked in. She stopped, looking at the boy sitting on her sacred boardroom table. A year ago, she would have fired someone for leaving a coffee cup on that wood. Now, she just smiled. She walked over, pulling a chair out and sitting down next to Leo. She was wearing a sharp, tailored blazer, but the hard, guarded edge around her eyes was completely gone. "You must be Leo," Claire said, leaning in. "Your dad talks about you all the time." "Are you the boss?" Leo asked, swinging his legs. "I am," Claire nodded. "But your dad is the one who tells me what to do. It's very confusing." Augustus laughed, a deep, resonant sound that filled the room. He leaned against the wall, watching the two of them. He thought about the yellow bucket. He thought about the gray water. It felt like a lifetime ago. He hadn't forgotten the dirt. He used it every day. He used it to keep the executives grounded. He used it to ensure that the contracts they signed actually helped the people pulling the ore out of the ground. He had forced Montgomery Global to invest $10 million into local infrastructure and medical clinics in the Katanga region. He was no longer a ghost. He was the conscience of a multi-billion-dollar empire. "Come on, Leo," Augustus said, tapping his watch. "It's 4:55, we have to go. Pizza night." Leo hopped off the table. He grabbed his backpack and ran toward the door. Augustus turned to Claire. "Have a good weekend, boss." "Augustus," Claire called out before he walked through the door. He stopped, turning back. "Thank you," Claire said quietly, "for interrupting that meeting." Augustus smiled. He looked around the pristine, glass-walled room. He looked at the woman who had given him his life back, and who he had, in turn, taught how to live. "Someone had to clean up the mess," Augustus said. He turned and walked out, the heavy glass doors closing behind him. Claire sat at the table for a moment longer. She touched the wood where Leo had been sitting. She felt grounded. She felt human. She looked out at the city, ready for whatever came next. Augustus went from mopping floors to commanding a billionaire's boardroom, not by changing who he was, but by forcing the corporate world to acknowledge the dirt on his boots. He proved that true leverage isn't found in spreadsheets or power suits. It's found in the raw, unapologetic truth of human survival. He saved a company, but more importantly, he saved his son and taught a ruthless CEO what it actually costs to be human. If Augustus's journey from the shadows to the skyline inspired you, smash that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more incredible dramas.